The silver frost of the Blackwood Valley didn't just bite at the skin. It hummed with the warning of 1,000 dead ancestors. Clarine Starling stood at the jagged edge of the Moz Peak, her breath hitching in a throat tightened by both freezing air and a terrifying magnetic pull she couldn't explain. Below her, the fortress of Nighthold sprawled like a sleeping obsidian beast, its jagged spires piercing the mist. It was the seat of the Lycan King, a man, if he could still be called that, whose name was used to quiet unruly children and make seasoned warriors check their throat guards. They told her he was a monster. They told her his heart was a cavern of ice and old blood. They warned her that to look into his eyes was to invite a darkness that never truly left you. But as the howl ripped through the valley, a sound so primal it vibrated in Clarine's very marrow, she didn't recoil. She leaned in. Hello to all of you joining us today. It is truly wonderful to have you here in the valley with us. I'd love to know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments below. I always find it fascinating to see how far these stories travel. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready for a journey into the shadows because this one is going to be intense. If you haven't already, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support means the world to me and ensures I can keep bringing these epic sagas to life for you. Now let's go back to the edge of that cliff, where the air smells of pine and impending fate. Clarine's fingers traced the rough bark of a sentinel tree, her knuckles white. She was a scholar of the old blood, a woman who had spent her life tucked away in libraries, but no parchment could capture the raw electric charge currently pulsing through the atmosphere. The elders of her village, the High Council of the Silver Saints, had forbidden any contact with the North. He is a predator of souls, Clarine, her mentor had hissed, his eyes wide with a fear that bordered on madness. He does not love, he only consumes. Stay in the light where it is safe. Safe. The word felt like a cage. She looked down at the scrap of parchment clutched in her hand, a map she had stolen from the restricted vaults. It wasn't just a map of the territory, it was a map of him. Rumors spoke of a king who had stayed in his shifted form for 3 winters, a king who had slaughtered his own court to protect a secret buried beneath the permafrost. The warnings the world gave her acted like fuel to a fire she hadn't known she was carrying. Her obsession wasn't just curiosity, it was a recognition. She felt a phantom ache in her chest, a tether pulling her toward the one person the world told her to fear most. A twig snapped behind her. Clarine spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Out of the swirling snow emerged a shape, too large for a wolf, too fluid for a man. It moved with a terrifying, silent grace, its fur the color of a moonless midnight. The creature stopped 10 paces away, its amber eyes glowing with an ancient, predatory intelligence. This was a guardian of the hold, a sentinel of the man she sought. Clarine should have run. She should have screamed for the Silver Saints to save her. Instead she took a step forward, her hand reaching out into the freezing void. I know he's there, she whispered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her soul. And I know he's waiting. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl that felt less like a threat and more like a challenge. It turned, vanishing into the thicket of thorns that led down into the forbidden valley. Clarine didn't hesitate. She plunged into the darkness after it, leaving the safety of the world behind. As the shadows of the Blackwood swallowed her whole, a chilling realization settled over her. The warnings weren't meant to protect her from the Lycan King's cruelty. They were meant to protect her from the truth of her own nature, a truth that was only now beginning to stir. The descent into the Moz Peak was a journey through a living graveyard of myths. Every twisted route seemed to reach for Clarine Starling's ankles, and every gust of wind carried the metallic tang of old battles. Clarine wasn't just a scholar by trade. She was a woman built of silent observations and a hunger for the why behind the stay away. Growing up in the sterile, silver-tiled halls of the High Council, she had been groomed to be a repository of history, a quiet, dutiful archivist who categorized the world without ever touching it. But her deepest desire had never been to record the lives of others. It was to find the missing piece of her own. For as long as she could remember, Clarine had felt a strange, hollow resonance in her chest, a frequency that didn't match the harmonious, peaceful hymns of her people. She feared she was broken, a vessel with a hairline fracture that let the darkness leak in. Her only confidant was Gideon Thorne, a veteran scout of the Silver Saints whose face was a map of scars earned on the borders of the Lycan territories. "You're looking for a ghost, Clarine," Gideon had told her just 2 nights ago, his voice hushed in the dim light of the archives. "The Lycan King, Lucius Blackwood, isn't a mystery to be solved. He's a force of nature that levels everything in its path. I've seen him turn a battlefield into a butcher's shop without shifting a single hair on his head. He doesn't have secrets, he has victims." Gideon was the only person who looked at Clarine with anything resembling affection, yet even his care felt like a shackle. He wanted to protect her, to keep her wrapped in the safety of the Council's lies. But Clarine had seen the way Gideon's hands shook when he spoke of the North. It wasn't just fear, it was awe. And that awe was the seed that had sprouted into her obsession. As she pushed through a thicket of frost-covered briars, the fortress of Nighthold loomed closer, its massive stone gates carved with the likeness of howling wolves. This was the heart of the Lycan kingdom, a place where strength was the only currency and mercy was a myth. She wasn't just here for a story, she was here because she suspected Lucius Blackwood held the key to the fracture inside her. She remembered the first time she'd seen his image in a forbidden ledger, a charcoal sketch that seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. His eyes had been depicted as voids, his jawline a jagged edge of stone. The text beneath it claimed he had been born of a blood moon eclipse, destined to unite the fractured packs through a reign of absolute terror. But Clarine had seen something else in those charcoal lines, a profound, bone-deep isolation. "Why do you run toward the flame, Clarine?" she whispered to herself, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Because the cold is killing you." Her motivation was simple yet soul-crushing. She would rather be destroyed by a king than wither away in a library. She needed to know if the monstrous nature the council preached was merely a mask for a truth they were too terrified to face. Suddenly the air pressure changed. The silence of the forest became absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. From the shadows of the massive gates, a woman stepped out. She was tall, her skin the color of polished mahogany, dressed in leathers that looked like they were made from the hide of a dragon. This was Alara Vane, the king's second-in-command and the deadliest hunter in the north. Alara didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. Her presence alone was a suffocating weight. She looked at Clarine's scholarly robes, now torn and stained with mud, and a slow, mocking smile spread across her face. "A silver saint," Alara mused, her voice like grinding stones. "The council usually sends assassins or spies. They don't usually send their librarians. What's the matter, little bird? Did you lose your way to the temple?" "I'm here to see the king," Clarine said, her voice sounding braver than she felt. Alara's laughter was a sharp, jagged sound. "Many want to see him. Usually it's the last thing they ever see. You smell of parchment and ancient fears, girl. There is nothing for you here but a cold grave." But as Alara stepped closer, her eyes narrowed. She caught the scent of something that shouldn't have been there. A faint, rhythmic pulse of power emanating from Clarine that didn't belong to the human realm. The smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine intrigue. "You have a secret buried in that fragile chest of yours, don't you?" Alara whispered, circling Clarine like a wolf assessing a wounded deer. "A hidden depth you haven't even named yet." Clarine didn't flinch. "I'm not leaving until I speak with Lucius." The use of the king's first name caused a ripple of tension to go through the Lycan guards hidden in the ramparts. No one spoke that name aloud. To do so was an act of either supreme arrogance or suicidal desperation. Before Alara could respond, a low, melodic chime echoed from the highest tower of the hold. The sound wasn't musical, it was a signal. The gates of Nighthold began to groan open, revealing a courtyard bathed in the orange glow of 1,000 torches. "The king has heard you," Alara said, her tone shifting from mockery to a strange, dark respect. "And for reasons I cannot fathom he has granted you entry. But remember this, Clarine Starling. The warnings you heard weren't meant to keep you safe from him. They were meant to keep us safe from what you might unleash." Clarine stepped through the threshold, her heart racing. She was walking into the mouth of the beast, leaving behind everything she knew for a chance to touch the fire. She felt Alara's gaze on her back. A reminder that in this world, secrets were more dangerous than silver. Are you feeling the tension yet? If you're enjoying Clarine's journey into the lion's den, make sure to leave a comment letting me know what you think her secret might be. Your theories keep this story alive and I love reading every single one. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to be the first to know when the next chapter drops. Clarine crossed the courtyard, the eyes of 100 Lycans tracking her every move. She wasn't a victim yet. She was a guest of the monster, and the real mystery was just beginning to unfold. The throne room of Nighthold was not a place of gold and velvet. It was a cathedral of bone and basalt. Massive pillars, carved from the very roots of the mountain, stretched upward into a ceiling lost in charcoal smoke. The air here was heavy, smelling of ozone, old leather, and a scent that Clarine could only describe as storm on the horizon. As she walked down the long, cold aisle, the Lycan guards fell silent, their predatory yellow eyes tracking her every movement. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne of jagged obsidian, was the man who had haunted her dreams since she first touched a forbidden scroll. Lucius Blackwood did not look like the raving beast the High Council described. He sat with a terrifying absolute stillness. His hair was the color of a winter raven's wing, and his features were so sharply defined they looked as though they had been hewn from the mountain itself. But it was his eyes that stopped Clarine's heart. They weren't amber like the others. They were a piercing, crystalline silver, the color of a blade under a full moon. "You have traveled far to deliver yourself to a monster, little scholar," Lucius said. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass Clarine's ears and strike directly at her spine. "The council usually sends their best warriors to die at my gates. Why have they sent a girl who smells of old ink and stubbornness?" Clarine stopped 10 paces from the throne. Her knees were shaking, but she forced her chin up. "They didn't send me. I came because I had to know if the stories were true." "The stories are always true," Lucius said, standing up. He was tall, impossibly tall, and moved with a fluidity that made the heavy stone floor seem like water. "I have broken kings. I have burned cities to keep my people fed. I am exactly what they warned you about." He stepped down from the dais and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stopped inches from her, his presence a wall of raw magnetic power. Clarine felt the fracture in her chest thrumming in response, a painful rhythmic heat that made her gasp. "You're lying," Clarine whispered, her gaze locked onto his. "You're not a monster. You're a prisoner." The silence that followed was deafening. Behind her, Ilara Vane shifted, her hand going to the hilt of her blade. No one spoke to the Lycan King this way. But Lucius didn't growl. He leaned in closer, his silver eyes searching her face with a sudden, searing intensity. "A prisoner," he repeated, his voice a dangerous silk. "And what exactly am I a prisoner of?" "The same thing I am," Clarine said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A destiny we didn't choose. A hunger that doesn't belong to the world they built for us." Before Lucius could respond, the heavy iron doors of the throne room burst open. A group of Silver Saint paladins, led by none other than Gideon Thorne, charged into the hall. Their silver armor gleamed with an unnatural, blinding light. Holy enchantments meant to burn Lycan flesh. "Clarine, get away from him!" Gideon roared, his sword drawn. "We're here to bring you back to the light." The room exploded into chaos. The Lycan guards shifted in a blur of fur and bone, their snarls shaking the foundation of the hold. But Lucius didn't shift. He moved faster than any human eye could follow, his hand snapping out to catch Gideon's silver blade mid-swing. The holy energy hissed against his palm, the smell of burning flesh filling the air, but Lucius didn't even flinch. He twisted the blade, snapping the enchanted steel like it was a dry twig. "You dare bring your false light into my house?" Lucius's voice was now a thunderous growl that echoed through the mountain. In the madness, Gideon reached out, grabbing Clarine's arm to pull her away. But as his fingers touched her skin, something impossible happened. A shockwave of violet energy erupted from Clarine, throwing Gideon and the other paladins back across the stone floor. The impact was so violent it cracked the pillars. Clarine fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her skin was glowing with a faint ethereal light, and the fracture in her chest felt like it had finally burst open. Lucius looked down at her, his expression shifting from rage to a stunned, haunting realization. He ignored his burned hand, reaching down to pull her to her feet. As their skin met, the violet light surged between them, forming a bridge of pure, crackling energy. "You're not a scholar," Lucius whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, desperate hope. "You're the catalyst. The revelation hit Clarine like a physical blow. The warnings weren't just about the king's cruelty. The council had known all along what she was, the only being capable of breaking the curse that kept the Lycans tethered to their animal rage. They hadn't been protecting her from Lucius. They had been keeping her away so she could never set him free. I don't understand, Clarine stammered, looking at her glowing hands. You will, Lucius said, his grip on her hand tightening. He turned to his guards, his eyes flashing with a new, terrifying purpose. Take the survivors to the pits. The girl stays with me. The war they've been trying to prevent just began. Are you as shocked as I am? The truth is finally starting to leak out of the shadows. I have to know. Do you think Gideon knew the truth about Clarine all along? Leave your theories in the comments. This is just the beginning of the twist, so if you're not subscribed yet, you're going to miss the moment everything changes. Clarine looked at Gideon, who was being dragged away, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and betrayal. Then she looked at Lucius. She was obsessed with a monster, but as the violet light hummed between them, she realized the monster was the only thing standing between her and a world of lies. The air in the upper spires of Nighthold was thinner, colder, and smelled perpetually of cedar and ancient stone. Clarine Starling sat by a massive arched window, watching the snow spiral into the abyss below. Since the eruption of power in the throne room, the Lycan guards no longer looked at her with hunger. They looked at her with a terrifying, reverent silence. She was no longer a stray human. She was a miracle or a curse, depending on who you asked. Lucius Blackwood entered the chamber without a sound. He had shed his heavy ceremonial furs, wearing only a dark tunic that showed the corded muscle of his arms and the faint silver-white scars of 1,000 battles. His hand, which had caught Gideon's blade, was wrapped in black silk, but he moved as if the burn didn't exist. The council sent their best to save you, Lucius said, his voice dropping into that low magnetic register that made Clarine's pulse skip. They are currently resting in the lower cells. Your friend, Gideon Thorne, is particularly vocal about your soul being in peril. Clarine turned, her eyes tracing the sharp lines of Lucius's face. Is it? In peril? Lucius walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space, though his energy seemed to wrap around her like a physical weight. Your soul is exactly where it was always meant to be, Clarine. They kept you in those archives because your blood carries the dormant spark of the first seers. You are the only bridge between my people's rage and the peace we lost centuries ago. And what if I don't want to be a bridge? Clarine whispered, her heart hammering. What if I just wanted to find out why I felt so empty? Lucius leaned in, his silver eyes locking onto hers. Then you found your answer. You were empty because you were looking for your other half in a world made of shadows. The tension between them was a living thing, a taut wire vibrating with every breath. Over the next few days, Lucius began the process of waking her. He took her to the ancient training grounds beneath the mountain, where the air hummed with the collective heartbeat of the pack. He showed her how to channel the violet heat in her chest, not through the rigid prayers of the Silver Saints, but through raw, unfiltered emotion. In one particularly intense session, as the snow battered the training ring, Clarine struggled to maintain control. The violet light flickered, erratic and jagged. You're thinking too much, Lucius growled, stepping into the ring behind her. He placed his hands over hers, guiding them toward a target of solid basalt. The contact was electric. Clarine felt his strength, his heat, and the low, constant hum of the wolf beneath his skin. Stop trying to archive the power. Let it hunt. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice trembling. If I let it out, I might lose myself. I might become, like you, a monster. Lucius's breath was hot against her ear. The world calls me a monster because I refuse to be a slave. Is that what you fear? Being free? With a sudden surge of frustration and attraction, Clarine let out a cry, and a beam of violet energy shattered the basalt pillar into dust. She stumbled back into his chest, gasping for air. Lucius didn't let go. He turned her around, his hands gripping her waist with a possessive urgency. For a moment, the world outside, the war, the council, the warnings, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of him and the terrifying realization that her obsession had evolved into something much more dangerous. A bond she couldn't break even if she wanted to. But the peace of the hold was a fragile thing. Ilara Vane appeared at the edge of the ring, her expression unreadable. The scouts have returned, Lucius. The The Silver Saints aren't just sending paladins anymore. They've mobilized the Iron Legion. They're bringing the Sun Eaters, siege engines designed to level the mountain. The romantic bubble burst instantly. Lucius's face hardened into a mask of stone. They want their catalyst back. They'd rather see this mountain fall than let the Lycans have a soul. Clarine felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She looked at Lucius, seeing the weight of his crown and the blood of his people on his shoulders. She realized then that her presence wasn't just a gift, it was a target. Every moment she stayed, she put the man she was falling for in the crosshairs of a genocidal army. Are you feeling that heat? Things are escalating faster than a wildfire in a pine forest. Do you think Clarine should stay and fight, or is she the very reason the Lycans are in danger? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment with your battle plans for Clarine. And if you're loving the chemistry between her and the king, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the midpoint revelation that's about to change everything. As Lucius began barking orders to Alara, Clarine caught a glimpse of Gideon being moved to a different cell through a high window. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. He didn't look like a rescuer. He looked like a man who knew a secret that was about to blow the world apart. Clarine's violet light flickered again, but this time it felt cold. She realized that while she was learning to trust the king, she had yet to uncover the final darkest truth about why the council feared their union so much. The atmosphere inside Nighthold shifted from a simmering tension to a full-blown storm. As the Iron Legion's war drums echoed from the base of the valley, the fortress felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Clarine Starling found herself drawn to the great hearth, a circular chamber where the Lycan lineage was carved into the very floor. Lucius Blackwood stood in the center, his silver eyes tracing the runes with a grim intensity. "You've been avoiding the library, Clarine," Lucius said without turning. "Are you afraid of what you'll find in my history or your own?" "I'm afraid of the blood," Clarine admitted, stepping into the light of the fire. "Every story I've ever read about the North ends in a massacre. I don't want to be the reason another one starts." Lucius turned, and for the first time the predatory mask slipped. He looked weary, the weight of centuries visible in the set of his shoulders. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, jagged crystal, a shard of moonglass that pulsed with a rhythmic violet light identical to the glow in Clarine's chest. "This is the heart of the first Lycan King," he whispered. "The High Council tells you we were cursed because of our greed. They tell you we are beasts because we rejected their light. But look closer, Clarine." He pressed the crystal into her palm. As their skin met, the room vanished. Clarine wasn't in the hearth anymore. She was standing in a memory. She saw the High Council of the Silver Saints, centuries younger, standing over a kneeling Lycan king. They weren't praying, they were harvesting. They were draining the violet essence, the catalyst energy from the Lycans to power their own holy relics. The Lycans weren't born monsters. They were driven to madness because the council stole their souls to fuel a golden empire. And the catalyst, the woman the council had protected in the archives, wasn't just a bridge. "I'm a battery," Clarine gasped, her eyes snapping open as the vision faded. "They didn't keep me in the archives to protect me. They kept me there to recharge. They need a new catalyst every 100 years to keep their Sun Eaters running," Lucius said, his voice thick with a suppressed rage. "You aren't a scholar to them, Clarine. You're a fuel source. And I'm not just a king. I'm the only one who can stop them from plugging you back into their machine." The revelation shattered everything Clarine believed about her home. The holy light of the Silver Saints was a stolen fire, and she was the wood intended for the pyre. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she cried, her hands trembling with the violet heat. "Because I needed you to choose me for who I am, not just because they are worse." Lucius stepped forward, his hands framing her face. The intimacy was sudden and overwhelming. "I have spent 500 years waiting for someone who could see the man behind the wolf. I wouldn't trade that for 1,000 victories." He kissed her then, a desperate, searing collision of ice and fire. It wasn't the gentle romance of the books she had archived. It was a reclamation. In that moment, Clarine felt the fracture in her chest seal shut. She wasn't broken. She was a weapon, and she was finally in the hands of the man who knew how to wield her. But the moment of passion was interrupted by a bone-shaking explosion. The north wall of the hold groaned as a beam of pure white energy, the Sun Eater's breath, carved through the obsidian. Ilara Vane burst into the room, her face streaked with soot. "They're through the first gate. And Lucius. They have a hostage. They're using Gideon Thorne as a shield. They say if the catalyst doesn't surrender, they'll execute him and every prisoner in the lower pits." Clarine felt the air leave her lungs. Gideon. The man who had been her only friend, who had likely been lied to just as much as she had. "If you go to them, Clarine, you never come back," Lucius warned, his grip on her arms tightening. "They will drain you until there is nothing left but a husk. And if I stay," Clarine looked at the crumbling wall, "everyone here dies for a lie I was told. Are you seeing the stakes now? This isn't just a love story anymore. It's a battle for the very soul of the world. What would you do in Clarine's shoes? Save your oldest friend and risk eternal imprisonment, or let the world burn for the man you love? I need your answers in the comments right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're going to miss the darkest hour of this journey." Clarine looked at Lucius, her silver-eyed king, and then at the smoke rising from the courtyard. She knew what she had to do, but for the first time she didn't know if she was strong enough to survive the choice. The air in the courtyard was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. The north wall, once an immovable barrier of ancient basalt, lay in jagged ruins. Through the gap, the Iron Legion poured in like a silver tide, their enchanted armor humming with a cold, predatory light. At the center of their formation stood the Sun Eater, a monstrous machine of brass and glowing crystals, its barrel aimed directly at the heart of the Nighthold. And there, lashed to the front of the machine, was Gideon Thorne. His silver armor was shattered, his face a mask of bruises, but his eyes, wide and filled with a desperate, frantic terror, locked onto Clarine Starling as she stepped out onto the ramparts. "Clarine, don't!" Lucius Blackwood roared, his voice a primal sound that shook the very stones beneath her feet. He reached for her, his fingers brushing the fabric of her cloak, but she stepped out of his reach. "If I don't go, they fire that thing," Clarine said, her voice hollow. "They'll level this entire mountain, Lucius. I can't let thousands die for my life. I can't let you die for me. I would rather see this mountain fall than see you in their chains." Lucius's eyes were no longer silver. They were a bleeding, molten amber, the wolf pushing against the surface of his skin with a violent urgency. "They will drain you, Clarine. They will turn your light into a battery for their genocidal toys." But Clarine wasn't listening to the warnings anymore. She was looking at the High Priest of the Silver Saints, a man she had once called Father, standing atop the Sun Eater. He held a crystalline staff that pulsed with a sickening, artificial radiance. "Return to us, child of the light," the priest's voice echoed across the battlefield, amplified by magic. "The monster has clouded your mind. Come back and your friend lives. Stay and he is the first to burn." Clarine looked at Lucius one last time. The obsession that had driven her across the frozen wastes was now a heavy, suffocating grief. She saw the king, the man who had shown her the truth, and she saw the monster the world wanted him to be. She realized that by staying she was confirming their lies. By leaving she was the only one who could save him. "I love you," she whispered, a sound lost in the wind. Before Lucius could stop her, Clarine threw herself from the rampart. She didn't fall. The violet energy in her chest flared, slowing her descent until her boots hit the blood-stained snow of the courtyard. The Iron Legion moved instantly, a dozen spears leveled at her throat. "Let him go," Clarine commanded, her voice ringing out with a power that made the soldiers flinch. The High Priest smiled, a cold, clinical expression. He signaled his men and they cut Gideon's bonds. The scout slumped to the ground, sobbing, but the soldiers didn't let him run. They held him there, a knife to his throat. "The girl first," the priest said. "Step into the siphon, Clarine. Give back what belongs to the light." Clarine stepped toward the Sun Eater. As she approached the machine, the violet light in her chest began to pulse painfully, drawn toward the brass coils like iron to a magnet. The moment she touched the platform, the machine hummed to life. Massive silver shackles snapped around her wrists and ankles, and a crown of thorns, etched with soul-draining runes, descended onto her head. The scream that tore from Clarine's throat was unlike anything the Lycans had ever heard. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony as the catalyst energy was ripped from her marrow. From the ramparts, Lucius let out a howl of such profound despair that the Iron Legion's horses reared in terror. He shifted, not with the grace he usually possessed, but with a violent, bone-snapping desperation. The massive black wolf leaped from the heights, crashing into the ranks of the Legion, but for every soldier he tore apart, 10 more took their place, armed with silver-tipped nets and holy fire. Run. Clarine gasped, her vision fading into a gray mist. She could feel her life force being funneled into the Sun Eater. The machine's glow turned from a cold white to a sickly, bruised purple. The high priest laughed, his eyes glowing with the stolen power. The king is a dog without a bone and the girl is a candle in a hurricane. This is the end of the North. Clarine watched through a haze of pain as Lucius was beaten back, pinned under a dozen silver nets, his golden eyes fixed on her with a look of such agonizing helplessness it hurt worse than the machine. She was being emptied. Her secrets, her desires, her very obsession, it was all being burned as fuel. Everything was dark. Everything was cold. The warnings were right. The connection was too dangerous to survive. The world was a muffled gray blur of agony. Clarine Starling could feel her very essence being siphoned through the silver crown, her memories of the archives, her stolen childhood, and even the heat of Lucius Blackwood's kiss feeling like they were being bleached out of her soul. The Sun Eater groaned, its brass pipes glowing a violent, angry purple as it gorged itself on her life force. Beside the machine, Gideon Thorne lay in the snow, his face pressed against the slush. He looked up, watching the light fade from Clarine's eyes, and something shifted in the man who had spent his life following orders. He looked at the high priest who was laughing, a sound of pure clinical greed, and then he looked at the massive black wolf pinned under the silver nets across the courtyard. Lucius wasn't fighting the soldiers anymore. He was simply staring at Clarine, his golden eyes leaking a dark, viscous grief. I told her he was a monster, Gideon whispered, his voice cracking. But you're a parasite. With a sudden, frantic burst of strength, Gideon lunged. He didn't go for the priest, he went for the Sun Eater's primary regulator, a massive moonglass crystal at the base of the siphon. He slammed his shattered shoulder into the glass, the impact sending a jolt of holy electricity through his body. The crystal cracked. The feedback was instantaneous. The violet energy, instead of being funneled into the siege barrel, surged backward. Clarine, take it back. Gideon screamed before a soldier's spear but slammed into his temple, knocking him unconscious. The scream that ripped from Clarine's lungs this time wasn't one of pain. It was a roar of reclamation. The fracture in her chest didn't just seal, it expanded. She realized that the council had spent centuries teaching her to be a vessel, a passive cup for their power. They never taught her that a vessel can also be a storm. My turn, Clarine hissed through gritted teeth. She didn't try to push the energy away. She pulled. She reached into the Sun Eater's core, grabbing the centuries of stolen Lycan souls stored within its brass belly. The violet light turned a blinding supernova white. The silver shackles on her wrists didn't just break, they vaporized. Across the courtyard, the silver nets pinning Lucius began to glow. The holy enchantments were being overwritten by a frequency they couldn't understand. Lucius felt the shift. The despair that had paralyzed his muscles evaporated, replaced by a surge of power so absolute it felt like the mountain itself was rising into his veins. He didn't just stand up, he exploded upward. The silver nets shredded like wet paper. Lucius shifted back to his human form mid-air, landing in a crouch, his silver eyes now burning with a white-hot celestial fire. Alara. To the gates. Lucius commanded, his voice a shockwave that knocked the nearest Iron Legionnaires off their feet. Alara Vane, who had been fighting a losing battle at the breach, let out a piercing whistle. The Lycan warriors, sensing the change in the tide, surged forward with a renewed, terrifying ferocity. They weren't fighting like cornered animals anymore. They were fighting like a liberated legion. Clarine stood atop the Sun Eater, the crown of thorns melting off her head. She looked down at the high priest who was scrambling backward, his holy staff sparking and dying in his trembling hands. You warned me about the king, Clarine said, her voice echoing with the depth of 1,000 ancestors. She stepped off the machine, hovering inches above the ground as the white-violet energy swirled around her like a cloak. But you forgot to warn yourselves about me. Lucius was at her side in a heartbeat. He didn't reach for her with caution this time. He took her hand and the connection was no longer a dangerous spark. It was a steady, unbreakable sun. Together they stood at the center of the chaos, the catalyst and the king finally in sync. "We end this now," Lucius whispered, his silver eyes meeting hers. "For the North. For us. For the truth," Clarine corrected, her fingers intertwining with his. The air around them began to vibrate with a low humming frequency that made the Iron Legion's armor start to crack. The Sun Eater was no longer a weapon of the Council. It was a bomb, and Clarine had the fuse. "Can you feel that? The tables haven't just turned, they've been flipped into the abyss. Gideon's sacrifice and Clarine's awakening have changed the game forever. What do you think the final confrontation will look like? Drop a comment with your predictions. And if you want to see the High Priest get what's coming to him, make sure you're subscribed for the climactic resolution." The High Priest looked at the duo, his face pale with the realization that he was no longer the predator. He signaled for the retreat, but the gates of Nighthold were already closing. There was no way out. Only the truth remained. The air in the courtyard didn't just vibrate, it shrieked. The Sun Eater, once a symbol of the High Council's absolute authority, was now a dying star trapped in a brass ribcage. Clarine Starling stood at the center of the swirling white-violet vortex, her hair whipping around her face like frayed silk. Beside her, Lucius Blackwood was a pillar of shadow and silver fire, his hand locked in hers, grounding the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the power she was channeling. "End it, Clarine," the High Priest screamed, his voice cracking as he scrambled toward the crumbling north wall. "You'll kill us all. You're a monster, worse than the beast you've crawled to." Clarine looked down at the priest, her eyes glowing with a clarity that made the very air around her ripple. "I am the truth you tried to bury in a library," she said, her voice resonant and multi-layered. "And the truth doesn't kill. It just burns away the lies." With a final, decisive surge of will, Clarine didn't push the energy outward to destroy. Instead, she pulled the remaining Sun Eater essence into herself and Lucius simultaneously. The machine let out a final, metallic sob before imploding, its brass gears turning to dust. The shockwave of pure, reclaimed Lycan souls didn't explode in a fireball. It moved through the courtyard like a cleansing tide of moonlight. As the wave hit the Iron Legion, their enchanted armor, powered by the very souls they had been suppressing, shattered. The soldiers didn't die. They were simply rendered powerless, their holy weapons turning to useless lead in their hands. The High Priest's staff disintegrated into splinters, leaving him clutching at the air, a frail old man stripped of his stolen divinity. But the real climax was happening within Lucius and Clarine. The energy they shared wasn't just power, it was a bridge. In that moment of absolute connection, Lucius's wolf and his man finally merged into a singular, harmonious being. The monstrous rage that had plagued him for 500 years was tempered by Clarine's light, and her empty fracture was filled by his ancient strength. "Look at me, Lucius," Clarine whispered. The Lycan King turned to her. For the first time, his eyes weren't just silver or amber. They were a brilliant, steady gold, reflecting a soul that was finally whole. He reached out not as a predator but as a partner, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that defied every warning she had ever heard. "I see you," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble of devotion. "I see everything." The battle was over. The Iron Legion was in full retreat, fleeing into the frozen wastes without their magic or their courage. Ilara Vane and the remaining Lycan guards stood in the ruins of the courtyard, dropping to their knees, not in fear but in a profound, silent salute to the new era that had just been born. Gideon Thorne groaned, stirring in the snow. Clarine rushed to his side, the violet light from her fingertips stitching his wounds back together with a gentle, humming heat. He looked up at her, then at the king standing behind her, and for the first time the fear in his eyes was gone. He saw the woman he had tried to save, and realized she had saved the world instead. "You were always meant for the mountains, Clarine," Gideon wheezed, a small, bloody smile on his face. "The archives were never big enough for you." Clarine looked back at Lucius, and then at the sunrise beginning to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Valley. The High Council was broken, their Sun Eater was gone, and the North was no longer a graveyard of myths. It was a kingdom of the living. Can you believe that? The most satisfying twist of all wasn't the destruction of the enemy, but the healing of the soul. The High Priest is powerless, the machine is gone, and our king and catalyst are standing tall. What was your favorite part of that final showdown? Drop a comment below, I want to know if you cheered when that machine imploded. And don't go anywhere because we have one final part to go. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time to join us for the grand finale. Lucius stepped toward Clarine, pulling her into a final triumphant embrace as the first rays of the sun hit the obsidian spires of Nighthold. The obsession was no longer a secret. It was a legacy. The winter that had gripped the Blackwood Valley for centuries didn't vanish overnight, but for the first time in living memory the air felt clean. The oppressive weight of the High Council's holy surveillance had lifted, replaced by a crystalline silence that hummed with new life. Clarine Starling stood on the repaired balcony of the high spire, her hand resting on the smooth obsidian railing. She was no longer dressed in the dusty, restrictive robes of a librarian. She wore a gown of deep midnight velvet, accented with silver filigree that caught the morning light. Behind her, the doors creaked open and Lucius Blackwood stepped onto the balcony. He moved with a new kind of grace. The restless, predatory tension that had once defined him had smoothed into the quiet, confident strength of a man who was no longer fighting his own nature. He didn't say a word. He simply stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent anchor in a world that was still finding its footing. "The Iron Legion has retreated past the southern border," Lucius said, his voice a warm resonance in the crisp air. "The High Priest is being held in the archives he once used to imprison your mind. He's discovering that without stolen power, he's just a man with a very long list of apologies to write." Clarine smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes. "It's a strange kind of justice, isn't it? To be forced to read the truths you tried so hard to erase." "It's the only justice that matters," Lucius replied, turning to face her. "But what about you, Clarine? The North is free, the Sun Eaters are scrap metal, and the Catalyst is... well, what are you now?" Clarine looked out over the valley, where the Lycan packs were beginning to gather in the courtyards below, not for war but for the great feast of the moon. She could feel the violet light within her, steady and rhythmic, no longer a fracture but a heartbeat. It was a power she shared with the man beside her, a bond that had transformed her obsession into a foundation. "I'm the woman who stopped listening to the warnings," she said softly. "I'm the architect of a new story." The romantic resolution between them wasn't a sudden, fleeting spark. It was a deep, earned fire. Lucius reached out, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. The gesture was old-world, courtly, and filled with a devotion that made the legends of the dukes and kings she had once read about seem pale in comparison. "The pack accepts you as their queen, Clarine," Lucius whispered against her skin. "Not because of the power you hold but because you chose us when the world told you we were nothing but shadows. You gave us back our souls. And you gave me a reason to use mine," she countered, stepping into his embrace. In the courtyard below, Gideon Thorne was helping Alara Vane organize the reconstruction efforts. Gideon had chosen to stay in the north, acting as a liaison between the liberated human villages and the Lycan hold. He looked up, catching sight of the king and his catalyst on the balcony, and offered a respectful nod. The bridge between their worlds was no longer a theory. It was a living reality. The story that had begun with a dangerous, forbidden obsession had ended in a reunion of spirit and a victory for the truth. The secrets were out, the power was restored to its rightful owners, and the future was a vast, unwritten map. Clarine realized that the warnings were never about the danger of the king. They were about the danger of change. And change, she decided as Lucius pulled her closer, was the most beautiful thing she had ever encountered. Wow, what a journey! From the dusty archives of the Silver Saints to the throne of the Lycan King, Clarine has finally found where she belongs. I am so glad you stayed with us until the very end to see this victory unfold. This story proves that sometimes, the things people warn you about are exactly the things that will set you free. What did you think of the ending? Are you happy Clarine stayed in the north, or did you want to see her return to the council to lead them? Leave a comment with your final thoughts on the story. I read every single one of them. And if you enjoyed this 40-minute emotional saga, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We have so many more mysteries to unravel and hearts to heal. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next story. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the Blackwood Valley in a golden glow, Clarine closed her eyes and leaned into Lucius. The cold was gone. The shadows were peaceful. And for the first time in her life, the girl who was obsessed with the king was exactly where she was meant to be.